Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'll just wait just a sec for people to come in as we get started. But I hope everyone's doing well. Feel free to put your name in the chat, where you're calling in from, how you're doing in the chat. But I'm really excited. I think I'll get started, and as people come in, they can continue to introduce themselves. But welcome, everyone. I'm really excited for this conversation. This is a conversation that will be kicking off our Earth Month programming. And this conversation really isn't coming out of nowhere in any respect. It's part of our long-term War is Not Green campaign at Code Pink, which is our work that emerged over 20 years ago when Code Pink started, when we were seeing in person the impacts of the so-called war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan. And over the past 2 decades, we've been working to expose the cost of war, of militarism, of imperialism on the planet, and the relationship between the people and the land that they live on, and to really put a spotlight on the fact that the US military is the largest institutional polluter in the world, that we have over 800 toxic bases globally, where each one is their own story of destruction, violations of sovereignty, and environmental destruction, and really how the US military functions as the enforcement mechanism for the fossil fuel industry, of tech billionaires, and of weapons contractors, which we're seeing play out so clearly right now. We've really routinely used this month as a way to do outreach, as so much attention is placed on Earth Day and the mobilizations around it, to really be an educational vehicle to grow our movement by working with people across anti-war and anti-imperialist organizing spaces, climate and environmental spaces. And we've really been starting to see the fruits of our labor recently, with some certain efforts from our campaign, like over 120 different organizations with thousands of individuals signing on to a letter that we released last year, stating a lot of these connections between the cost of war and militarism and climate and environmental crisis. There's been a lot of mainstream environmental organizations screening films like Earth's Greatest Enemy that document all of this. And large parts of the climate world and environmental organizing spaces have also really been very clear about the contradictions that we've been seeing in the first months of 2026, with the US bombing Iran and its oil fields, its natural gas fields, invading Venezuela and abducting its president, and expanding its aggression and blockade on Cuba. And so we've seen, slogans that I think are really putting this at the forefront, like "No blood for oil," and massive convergences that have happened and are planned, which we'll be talking a little bit about tonight, like Confronting Sarah Week in Houston, the International Conference for the Phase Out of Fossil Fuels in Santa Marta. And I think we're also seeing a lot of this come together, even if subconsciously, in moments around organizing around data centers across the country, which of course are both products of war and products for war. And so we'll hear a few different incredible speakers tonight. We'll hear from Anthony, who is a regular on these calls at this point, and is in like every Zoom call that I'm on. But Anthony's from Black Lines for Peace, and the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project, which is engaged in a lot of these spaces uh, in the prep for Santa Marta, and work around data centers and many more things. We're from Isabella from the Youth Climate Finance Alliance, which is an organization really leading the way in organizing against fossil imperialism. Was also a key organizer of the Confronting Sarah Week conference in Houston, and also has chapters around the country. We'll hear from Rachel from the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, which is also a really crucial organization as part of the conference for the phase out of fossil fuels, and is making these connections all the time. And I think it really charts a perspective of ways that we can not only resist militarism, imperialism, and climate destruction, but create something where we're to generate sort of the future that we want, a fossil fuel treaty in its holistic definition. And so we're also going to start out with a brief 12-minute recorded conversation with Owen from the Conflict and Environmental Observatory, which produces really crucial research on a lot of these different connections. I think will set us up for really understanding the moment that we're in, particularly around US-Israeli aggression on Iran. And so, Grace, if we're able to get the recording up.
One second.
Hi everyone, thanks Aaron. So my name is Owen Derbyshire. I'm a senior researcher at CEOBS and have been for many a year now. If you've not come across us before, the Conflict and Environment Observatory, we are a UK-based charity and we work on the environmental consequences of armed conflicts and military activities, both during war and in peacetime. At its core, our role is to try provide a voice for the environment and for the people who depend on it when it faces harm from conflict and military activity. Now, this includes a real wide range of environmental harms. Climate impacts are part of that, and they are increasingly recognised through events like this. But they are only one piece of the picture. So in many conflicts, the most immediate risks come from things like damage to water systems, conflict pollution, or the disruption of livelihoods. And these all directly affect civilians on the ground. So our work really tries to keep those impacts visible and to document them and to make sure they're sort of grounded in the experiences of the affected communities. So we do that by collecting and analysing data, by supporting it recently, especially lots of journalists and researchers, and then maybe on a sort of higher level, engaging with governments and international organisations to sort of strengthen and change norms around how wars are fought and military activities are conducted. And that's all because a lot of the environmental harm that arises from war isn't inevitable. It is all shaped by decisions. And there's a real scope really to actually reduce the harm, both during the conflicts, but also outside them. Um, although where they have already occurred, we also want to make sure we have the information and the data there to support recovery efforts, so they can be environmentally sound and sustainable and just for affected communities.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's such incredible and crucial work. And I know Codepink, we've definitely used a lot of your work when I think trying to communicate this crisis to people and the necessity to build a mass movement. And so I think, especially right now, with the recent US and Israeli escalation on Iran, the bombing of oil facilities, the of oil fields, natural gas fields, of the threatening of bombing desalination plants. I think a lot of this is becoming incredibly clear to people. I think seeing the images of black smoke and oil rain over the skies of Tehran was such a horrific sight. I know y'all have done a little bit of research on this and writing on it, and so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your research on Iran has shown so far on the environmental impacts of this US-Israeli bombing and what might be some of both the short and long-term impacts.
Yeah, sure. I mean, since the start, only a month ago, it feels longer, of the escalation, we've been sort of trying to rapidly document and do environmental assessments of incidents using remote sensing, satellites, and open source information, sort of building on a sort of systematic approach that we've developed for Ukraine and are now using in Iran and Sudan and other places. And what we hope is that by doing this and publishing on it early, where and supporting journalists reporting it as well, we're sort of making sure environmental risks are seen in as part of the reporting and like play a role in making sure the environment is prioritized and understood internationally. And I think we've come a really long way, certainly since I started at CEOBS 7 years ago in putting that environmental perspective higher up in the terms of priorities. In terms of what we are seeing, it's important to, I guess, look across the whole region and the full pattern of hostilities. So there's different targeting profiles. I guess at the start, there was lots of attacks on military infrastructure, especially. That's starting to change now. There's more civilian linked infrastructure, increasingly attacks on sort of industrial or energy related sites. And from an environmental perspective, this matters because many of those places carry inherent pollution risks to people's health. And under international humanitarian law, there are obligations to limit harm, of course, and consider foreseeable environmental effects. So when we see this sort of infrastructure attacked, um, we need to be documenting and understanding what's happening because the risks can be very immediate, but they can also extend well beyond the immediate strike. So I guess the example there would be you've already mentioned these attacks in Tehran on the oil storage infrastructure. There's the initial incident of the smoke and people breathing that in, and that's very hazardous. But then there's longer term implications from that same incident in terms of contamination of soil or groundwater with uh, oil products, which may then, you know, get back into humans. And yeah, all of these things operate on different timescales. I think it's also important to mention this particular war has a lot of high risk sites, in particular the nuclear facilities, the uranium processing sites, or wherever the enriched uranium material is, if that's been attacked, because obviously there's potentially very severe consequences, transboundary consequences. The same is true with attacks on desalination plants in particular. Um, there, any further there's already been attacked, but any further escalation, could pose an incredible, significant risk to the people's ability to drink water in the entire region. Um, as I say, it's region wide, so it's very difficult to track everything that's happening. Let's look for a second, maybe at Lebanon. So we've seen there sort of lots of mini examples of what we saw in Tehran, where we've had repeated attacks on lots of petrol stations, provoking lots of individual localized pollution risks. Um, and yeah, you can have the big incidents like in Tehran, but you can also have lots of the cumulative effect of lots of little ones as well. So sort of, I guess, to tie all that together in the short term, we have impacts on air quality, on public health, and on critical services. But then over the longer term, we see more issues of contamination, environmental degradation of land, of water, loss of livelihoods that are linked to the environment, or loss of ecosystem services. Um, what we do know is that even though if lots of this is uncertain right now, we don't know what direction everything is exactly going to go in. We need to be monitoring it, and we need to be communicating the risks and addressing them to like minimize the long-term impacts.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I think one thing that we're sort of thinking through here is that, this is a new resource war in many ways. I think, you can get into sort of all the different reasons for the US and Israel's strikes on Iran, but one major part is also that it has the third largest oil reserves in the world. And of course, we've seen what has happened in West Asia and North Africa over the past few decades during the so-called war on terror. And, one metric there is that there was is the carbon emissions from that getting up to 1.2 billion metric tons of emissions. But of course, there was also so much devastating environmental and public health impacts from the war on terror and the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of what we can learn from comparing the past to what we might expect to see in the present.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. So many lessons to learn, and we should be learning from them, whether we will, whether we have. maybe a different question. I guess the most significant difference so far is the this is still a war from above. It's not don't have boots on the ground. It's not like Iran and Afghanistan so far. And in a way that sort of changes a bit the profile of harm. So in Iran, Afghanistan, lots of the impacts were linked to the ground presence. Um, Things like the sort of land degradation or pollution at military sites, the burn pits. We saw pressures on water resources, and they had a really big long-term impact for those communities who lived there, as well as lots of the veterans who have since come back. I think what we're seeing now is more sort of concentrated incident-driven harm. So like individual strikes or multiple strikes on particular sites or particular areas. Um, and I think that creates more acute short-term risks right now compared to maybe the longer-term risks associated with a massive US base in Iran or Afghanistan. Um, I guess the key lesson is that environmental harm during the so-called war on terror was not particularly recognized. It was under-recognized. It's only in the years that have passed that we've better understood it and been able to understand the health and livelihood impacts. Um, Now that we have that knowledge, and now that we also have better tools uh, to monitor and assess what's going on, so we have more satellites, we have more uh, apps, more data sharing, we should be able to do lots more, but we're seeing some of the same patterns repeated. And on top of that, we have a lot of new stuff. So we have autonomous or remotely operated systems and drones, and this creates a whole new set of questions about uh, how environmental risks are considered within military operations. Many of these are sort of effectively disposable systems, um, and so their sort of resource footprints are still not very well understood. They're not receiving much attention, but that's certainly likely to be a significant source of environmental harm and maybe displaced from where the conflict's happening. Um, yeah, I guess and more compared to the war on terror, I guess the whole global situation has changed as well. The international rules-based system is under more strain, and that makes any consistent application of protections more challenging. Um, so yeah, I think just to sum up there, whilst awareness and tools have improved, I guess progress in changing behaviour and norms has been a bit more limited. Um, but this sort of only reinforces that importance of early monitoring and integrating the environment into the public mindset when we're talking about the war.
So huge shout out to Owen for doing this pre-recorded interview. He was unfortunately not able to join us live, considering that it is very late night, very early morning, his time right now. And there is around another 5 to 7 minutes-ish of conversation that we had that we can drop the full link to the recording in the chat, but we had to cut it a little bit short for time. But we got into a little bit on the broader climate impact of this, where there's a lot of research coming out on some of the emissions, and which is definitely worth thinking about more as well. And I'll also drop an article around some of that on some research that's been published. But one thing that he does speak about that I think is also crucial to understand is that there's not the same comparison that we have yet around what ground troops would mean, but there is the threat of ground troops in Iran, and we've seen the impacts of heavy metals still in children's hair samples. And so I think everything that he says reinforces the necessity of putting a spotlight on these connections and continuing to do everything that we can to stand against this war and imperial aggression. But I will now transition a little bit into the live speakers that we have here. We'll hear a little bit of 5 minutes from everyone first on their general organizational orientation to how folks see the work right now and the current moment regarding some of the connections between climate and environmental crisis and militarism and the various sort of opportunities that you all see in advancing some of these connections and doing more effective organizing with one another. Um, and then we'll get into a little bit more of a panel discussion and crosstalk. So definitely keep for the audience putting questions in the chats, and we'll try to answer as much as we can, time permitting, of course. But Anthony, you're unmuted, so I'm going to pick on you if you want to immediately jump off uh, and give your 5 minutes.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And yes, that was awesome. Really appreciated that information. My name is Anthony Karifa Rogers Wright. I'm with the Black Alliance for Peace and the North-South Project for People-Centered Human Rights. I would be remiss if I did not name Hag Pesach Sameach to all who are observing Passover like I am. It's, we're going to be talking about contradictions today, Aaron, right? And of course, there's a contradiction of observing a holiday that's about emancipation and liberation when a Zionist ethno-state is doing the exact opposite of that to other people. And it continues to be a hard holiday to observe since this genocide commenced. But important to just get right into it. I'm so excited to be here with Isabella and Rachel. Rachel is one of my favorites to wax poetic with, and I'm a big fan of Isabella's work. And of course, Rachel and I will be in Santa Marta, Colombia. My God, in like 3 weeks, to to talk about what is necessary to phase off of fossil fuels as quickly as possible. It's even interesting now, when people talk about 1.5, where we know we've blown way past that, not way past, but we've blown past that metric and that goal. And militarism is a big reason for that, right? I mean, the emissions we just heard from the comrade you just spoke to, Aaron, the emissions that are associated with war and militarism, and even when we're not at war, just the exercises and whatnot. And we simply don't have a full aggregate estimate of the emissions of war and militarism, right? The Pentagon, and I say the Pentagon because our country has the dubious honor and uncertain accolade of having the military that is the largest single user of fossil fuels and the largest single emitter in the world. And that's why at BAP we say, militarism increases climate change through all of its emissions. And then on, the flip side, climate change increases militarism, both internationally and globally. And when we're talking about those contradictions, this week with the Black Agenda Report, which is a awesome international publication that's heavily partnered with the Black Alliance for Peace, we talked about this idea that the empire has no clothing, right? And speaking of the U.S. empire, the clothes are off. Trump ripped off the clothes, but I mean, we've known about this nudity about U.S. imperialism for some time. But at this stage in history where we are, right, when we have seen a shift from competitive capitalism to monopoly capitalism, now we are really seeing the true impacts of militarism. And what we try to focus on at the Black Alliance for Peace with our climate, environment, and militarism initiative is that we really cannot have a serious conversation anymore about addressing the climate crisis if we're not going to address militarism. It's with everything that we're seeing now, it's simply not enough to be anti-war. We also have to be anti-imperialism. We talk about the root causes of the climate crisis: white supremacy, patriarchy, colonization. We have to talk about the root causes of war as well. And it's that imperialist mindset of when you shift to monopoly capitalism, and you'll even start turning on your so-called allies, right? Now, I'm going to say something a little controversial, not for you, Aaron and Rachel and Isabella, but this idea of Trump pulling out of NATO, that might be one of the best things he's ever done for climate change, actually, if he actually goes ahead and does that, because we know that there's a nexus between NATO increasing the amount of GDP, NATO countries increasing their GDP for war is going to lead to more emissions. But what is driving all of that is this idea of imperialism and resource wars. It's fossil fuels now, but critical minerals are quickly becoming, the new fossil fuels. and we're even doing a shakedown. Listen to what Trump just said, right? No, I'll end the war. He finally called it a war in Iran, but I'll let them still control the Strait of Hormuz. But basically saying to NATO countries, you have two choices: go take it yourself, or you can buy from the United States. Right? So it's literally a shell game, literally and figuratively. And then, we also have to talk about the idea of ecocide. And I think that the comrade you were just speaking to, Aaron, definitely touched on that. I'm going to put in the chat a new report that came out that is so striking that the Palestinian organization that released it had to remove their name from the report. They did it in partnership with the University of Newcastle in the United Kingdom on ecocide, and everything that he said was absolutely right. We won't even know the full extent of how many lives are going to be lost probably for the next 5 or 10 years because of all the pollutants that they're breathing in, all the debris, all the chemicals, the contaminated soil and water that they're forced to drink and use for sustenance that he named. And so we have to talk about ecocide as a function of fossil fuels. And then we also have to talk about oil itself as a weapon. Right. Oil, whether it's being used as a weapon to kill people, as we saw with the draconian strikes on Iranian oil systems, like turning oil flowing out of the sky and literally impacting people in real time. And then oil as a form of soft imperialism, as we're seeing now with the Revolutionary Republic of Cuba, with a boot on its neck by the United States. And surprise, surprise, right? It was Russia that basically had to go in, of all countries, to give Cuba about a 10-day lifeline. I would posit that if we really want to help Cuba right now, the best thing we can do is like transition its entire energy system to renewable and batteries. And then, we also are starting to see now why the transition off of fossil fuels is a form of peace, right? No one ever invades a country for their solar panels and wind turbines, right? Like we're going to take those wind turbines, and it very much gets you off of that system. Two more things, and then I'll stop because I can't wait to hear from Isabella and Rachel. Is that we do talk about imperialism from an international sense a lot, but in the United States, I think we can all agree we have seen and we've experienced either directly or indirectly the full force of domestic imperialism and domestic colonialism. It takes a lot of fossil fuels to send ICE agents to terrorize and invade entire cities. We still don't have the metrics on how much our domestic military is using in fossil fuels and how much they are emitting. But we know that as the surveillance state continues to grow, which also takes a lot of fossil fuels, it's going to heavily be used against us, right? Wasn't it scary that we were hearing reports of people in Minneapolis, ICE agents going up to them and saying, hello, so and so, and telling them their entire name because of that surveillance system? And then, of course, Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, right? We're about to commemorate 10 years of Standing Rock. We know that militarism, domestic militarism, was a big part of what was suppressing the water protectors in that indigenous-led resistance. So we also have to have a handle on domestic imperialism and domestic colonialism as part of this phase out, and just climate action is good for peace, just like care work is good for peace. And I think, again, I'll just end by saying being anti-war is not enough. We have to embrace an ethos of anti-imperialism. And I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to hearing from my friends.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Are either of you feeling called to go next? Isabella, do you want to go?
Yeah, I can do it. Yeah, hi everyone. As Aaron mentioned, my name is Isabella. I lead communications work at Youth Climate Finance Alliance. We're a youth-led network providing direct and distributed support to the next generation of eco-socialist organizers. Over the past year, we've seeded half a dozen democratically controlled and locally led chapters called Ignition Front, that are serving as the national mass organization and action-oriented arm of Youth Climate Finance Alliance. Ignition Front emerges as a practical response to critique that we and many, many others, including those folks who are on the panel with me today, have levied against the mainstream US climate movement. a movement that has long been steered by liberalizing forces of carbon essentialism, technocratic solutions, and a misplaced faith in existing electoral and legislative structures, as well as a predominance of whiteness and American chauvinism. That climate movement is reactionary. It's not rooted in reality or in study. The reality, in fact, is that in the 500 years since the capitalist world system began to take shape, the Earth's ecological boundaries have been violated like never before. Communities across the globe have felt their relationships to land, to labor, and to one another deteriorate because the degradation and never-ending extraction from indigenous people and their land are intrinsic to the capitalist system. In particular, the relentless extraction and production of fossil fuels have pushed Earth's climate to a devastating breaking point. And this crisis is not merely the fault of a few bad actors. As much as we hate the fossil fuel billionaires and their cronies, no, the ecological crisis that we face is a political problem. And it's produced by a US-led system of fossil-fueled imperialism. This global arrangement of imperialism is designed to extract value from the global south for the benefit of the global north, a process that is fundamentally driven by fossil fuel extraction. So the result here is a brutal irony, right? The nations of the periphery, having contributed the least to fossil pollution, are now on the front lines of its most devastating impacts, from rising sea levels in countries like my family's home country of the Philippines to climate-fueled droughts and superstorms. It's true, like I said, that the nations who have contributed the least to fossil pollution are now on the front lines. Ignition Front, like many other organizations, or most other organizations on this panel, operates in the belly of the imperial beast. The actions of the country in which we live, its government, its military, and financial institutions severely and negatively impact people and ecosystems across the globe. And so it is up to us to create an enduring ecological movement based in the so-called US that is interested in ending the system of imperialism and is guided by its solidarity with revolutionaries in the global south. But I must add that we don't simply see a connection between US militarism and ecological destruction. Rather, to correctly tackle one or the other would require us to understand that frontline fights against ammonia plants and liquefied natural gas refineries in Texas and Louisiana, that flotillas to Cuba and to Gaza, and that campaigns to disrupt the weaponry and supply chains of US militarism, these are all fronts in one unitary struggle against US-led fossil-fueled imperialism. To tackle one of those fights is to take part in that singular struggle. And so that brings me to this present moment. Because in the past year, since we began seeding Ignition Front, the contradictions of the capitalist world system have deepened immensely. We're witnessing the violent convulsions of a weakening empire. The old rules and norms-based order, like our comrade at the beginning mentioned, it's crumbling. And in its place, an emerging US-based fascist coalition is consolidating. It's uniting finance, capital, tech oligarchs, and fossil fuel executives with a mass base of white nationalists. And their goal is to salvage a second American century through unrestricted force, both abroad and at home. We're seeing this play out in real time. The drumbeats of war against Iran, the aggression and resource extraction toward Venezuela, the ongoing blockade of Cuba, and the genocidal arming of Israel, so-called Israel. These are the desperate attempts of a dying hegemon to maintain its grip on the world. The imperial core is fracturing, and as it does, the material basis between the most oppressed communities inside the belly of the beast, us, and the increasing sovereign movements of the global south, that basis for solidarity has never been stronger. And so while the Venezuelan masses and the Palestinian freedom fighters resist imperialism abroad, those of us who reside here in the so-called US must rise to the occasion. Let us organize at points of fossil fuel production, like refineries in the US Gulf South, and against the financiers of fossil imperialism. For this is our duty, and at this we must win. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for that, Isabella. One fight yeah, I think is one of the most crucial aspects of what we're trying to do here. And I think trying to centralize and understanding that we're not, there's so much, I think, that people are seeing from sort of every side and every angle. And I think the tendency to be so overwhelmed is something that I think everyone is dealing with right now. And so I think understanding who our common enemies are, who our common targets are, and spaces that we can really convene and organizing around is absolutely crucial right now. So thank you for that, Rachel.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that really incredible analysis from both of you. You make my job a little bit easier now. So my name is Rachel, and I am a global coordinator with the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, which is a global initiative that is aimed at fostering international cooperation around a binding international agreement that would really address the gap in international governance around fossil fuel production and supply, and would do so by trying to address three pillars, which include a global just transition away from fossil fuels that really take into account both economic dependence and energy dependence on fossil fuels in order to make sure that we're centering the needs of communities in the transition away from fossil fuels versus the preferences of companies. And then an end to any new expansion of fossil fuels, of new coal, oil, or gas infrastructure, and orderly, fair, rapid wind down of existing production in keeping with what the science shows is necessary to address the climate crisis. And this campaign really came from the fact that, we have the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, which are really focused on emissions, and they don't mention fossil fuels even once in the documents. And part of the reason for that is exactly what Isabella was saying, this US imperialist fossil fuel regime that we are living under, and the fact that these processes require full consensus of all countries that are involved in them, which means that the US can serve as a blocker. US and other petrostates can be blockers in the UNFCCC process. And so it's been really incredibly difficult to even have fossil fuels be mentioned at these conferences, let alone to have any type of like global work plan for how we would phase out fossil fuel production. And so the campaign sort of seeks to, one, drag fossil fuels to the center of the climate conversation. Fossil fuels are responsible for 86% of carbon emissions. You can't really talk about ending the climate crisis without talking about fossil fuels, but also to really name fossil fuels as a threat to humanity more broadly, from the health impacts to the environmental impacts in ecocide, as Anthony was mentioning, but also to their ongoing role in international conflict, both as a driver of international conflict, as a necessary part of militarism, and as a tool of imperialism in ways that Anthony and Isabella both have named really well. And there's a link in the chat to a, a report that the treaty and our partners at WILPF put out last year that really covers all of the myriad ways that fossil fuels are linked to international conflict. They've been linked to like 25 to 50% of all interstate conflicts in the past couple of decades. So they really are a massive driver. And then they're also a massive driver of human rights violations in all sorts of other ways. Like man camps around fossil fuel production sites are a huge source of gender-based violence, violence against Indigenous peoples, violence against local communities. And so, this sort of like human rights impacts of a fossil fuel-based world order is is threatening on so many different fronts to human life, to the environment, to security. And and we need, therefore, like international cooperation in order to be able to do something about them. You're never going to be able to phase out fossil fuel production just by having national plans alone, because of the ways that imperialism forces countries' hands at having their natural resources be open to international investment. It's, been terms of like IMF loans forever that countries need to have their assets be opened to international investment. Debt has been trapping countries into having economies that are reliant on fossil fuel production. And so, yeah, international cooperation is going to be necessary in order to be able to tackle this problem. And so the fossil fuel treaty campaign has been one seeking to like really bring this conversation to the center of global conversations around climate and fossil fuels, but then also to learn from past initiatives that have done a, good job at curbing the behavior of countries and commodities and weapons that are causing such a risk to human life. And so, the campaign for a fossil fuel treaty has a really sharp theory of change that has a really strong understanding of how power and influence operates in multilateralism, the role of petrostates as blockers on climate action, and the ways in which even small coalitions of countries can shift global norms in ways that have huge impacts. And so, learning from, for instance, the landmine ban treaty that, the US was never a signatory to. Some of the other like major users of landmines were never a signatory to the landmine ban treaty. And yet it led to a massive reduction of stockpiling of landmines. It has created the space for digging up landmines in a lot of different places. It has like made them go out of norm or go out of fashion as a weapon of war. And similar, learned from how the nuclear nonproliferation treaty was won and negotiated, and how that created then space to move into a conversation about a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and how you sort of like build increasing international space to shift norms away from like at one point the stockpiling of nuclear weapons was seen as the greatest pathway to safety for countries, and now there's like a different international conversation around nuclear weapons as really dangerous to humanity. And so these treaties have obviously not like been silver bullets to any of those problems, but they have shifted international norms, and they have been ways that coalitions of non-producer countries have been able to shift the behavior and influence international norms in ways that can impact even countries like the US, which are not signatories. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from that type of global South-led coalitions from countries on the front lines collectively working together to turn their power on countries that have historically been allowed to just behave however they want to. And so I think that there's a lot of things to learn from, or there's a lot of things that we've been learning from those past treaty efforts and are now bringing to this conversation around uh, fossil fuels and how we, yeah, can bring an end to the fossil fuel era and do so even if the US is never necessarily a signatory to a fossil fuel treaty.
Thank you so much for that. That's so incredibly helpful. And I really want to sort of zero in a little bit on some of the convenings that we've been talking about, because I think they're both ways to sort of assess the barometer of where the movement is, how much sort of the different elephants in the room that we're addressing are spotlit, and also ways that we can bring in the very specific context of past convenings, of the different geographies that convenings are in, and how that might shape the context of the demands that are set forward, and the organizing that's able to happen, how it's able to reflect on the broader movement. So I maybe want to start with what just happened before moving into what is going to happen. So Isabella, I'm going to come back to you for a sec to talk a little bit about Sarah Week in Houston. And for those who don't know, and you can give a little bit of your own overview as well. It is one of the world's largest oil, gas, and energy conferences. It's the Super Bowl of all these tech executives and speakers from Google and Microsoft and Amazon Web Services, mining companies like Rio Tinto and Glencore, tech companies, every fossil fuel company, and also military executives as well, and former military executives. So I think it really exemplifies the fossil fuel imperialist regime that we're talking about here. And we also actually had an action specifically asking one of the largest environmental organizations in the country, the Environmental Defense Fund, why they were a partner in this conference. Because I think this is, we want to bring as many folks into the climate movement as possible, but we also really want to examine the connections here and why organizations feel tied to sort of working within the context of these conferences of folks who are destroying the world and continuing extraction in every form. There's no green way to extract or bomb children. And so I think I'd love to hear your report sort of on the organizing that converged at the conference. It pulled from people around the region in the Gulf South, and what you sort of see as any takeaways that we can learn in our future organizing and in regional organizing as well.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Yeah, as Aaron mentioned, CERAWeek is this annual conference which takes place in downtown Houston year after year. And it's commonly kind of referred to as the Super Bowl of oil and gas conferences. It's one of the largest oil and gas conferences in the world, and largest convenings of CEOs and decision makers who sort of meet in this very fancy hotel over very fancy drinks, and meanwhile, just, blocks away, their fossil fuel projects are destroying the lives of Black and Brown Houstonians, and Texans and Louisianans across the Gulf South as well. And so for the past couple of years, a number of community groups have got together to confront CERAWeek. And these are all groups who, for the most part, are being led by communities that are at what we call the fence lines of major polluter projects. People whose backyards are right behind a refinery, or whose children attend a school right next to, an ammonia plant, etc. And so, yeah, as I said, they've been putting together a sort of confrontation against CERAWeek for the past couple of years, marches and rallies, and following the CEOs around when they go out on their lunch break and asking them hard questions. But this year, I think, was really different because we had the opportunity to bring in folks who are running campaigns that are also thinking about fossil fuels, not just as a local issue of, a particular plant being built in someone's backyard, but kind of questioning, like, okay, where is the oil being used at this plant? Is it going to fuel genocide in Palestine? And people who are really asking questions like that kind of came to the table this year to take part in the confrontation against CERAWeek. So we had folks who are a part of the BDS campaign against Chevron. And for folks who don't know, I'm going to pull up my notes because Chevron's not my campaign, so I want to make sure I get their numbers right. But Chevron fuels nearly 50% of the Zionist electricity grid, including military bases, prisons, police stations, and illegal settlements. It's also the only U.S. oil company that currently operates in Venezuela, and so has sort of positioned itself as being one of the first corporations to have a stake in this sort of corporate bidding war again, on Venezuela's resources. And so Chevron is an imperialist villain, and we were really lucky to have many community organizers come to CERAWeek and talk about that. People who, have Chevron plants right in their backyard were coming to the forefront and saying, like, look, we know the connections. Like, it's not just us here in Texas. It's also folks in Palestine. It's also folks in Venezuela that are feeling the impact of this awful corporation. And I think there's a lot of excitement amongst people who live on the front lines and the fence lines of this fossil fuel build out, excitement to connect with folks across the global South, and to talk more about how these corporations and these financiers, etc., are ruining all of our lives. And that's true of, like I said, the Chevron campaign was very big at CERAWeek, but also our campaign with Ignition Front is against Citibank, which is the largest funder of fossil fuel expansion projects. So that's like new fossil fuel build out, both here in the U.S. and the U.S. Gulf South, but then also around the world. And then Citibank is also the largest foreign financial institution in the Zionist entity as well. So these connections are really, really clear. I think someone said earlier, I wrote it down. I didn't write who said it, but someone said earlier, we have common enemies, right? The climate movement and the anti-imperialist movement. And so there's really such a ripe area for us to collaborate, because so many of these fossil imperialists are partaking in so many awful projects, be that the physical fossil fuel infrastructure, or fueling the weapons as they go out across the global south.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, watching some of the organizing that was coming out of that was, I think, really incredible. And we had some folks that went, or we had someone from Portland also who went there, and I think learned so much and connected with. I learned so much from hearing everything about it from her. And so I think, I mean, it's, I think, really the pinnacle of, I think, what we need to be striving for, especially I think when fostering that regional to international connection. So I now want to move into sort of the international sphere as well, and the conference coming up, the International Conference for the Phase Out of Fossil Fuels, which will be happening in Santa Marta at the end of April. And many of us have sort of been in the process of engaging and preparing in various ways, various working groups, various listservs, but and some of us will be convening there. I'm unfortunately not going to be able to be there in person probably, but I would love to hear from Anthony and Rachel, who are both also in this preparation process, a little bit on what your organizational orientations and goals for it are, and what the role is around bringing in militarism during and after this conference, and sort of what its larger implications could be, need to be for the movement that we bring sort of back here, and are.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna have like amazing conversations with Rachel and other comrades while we're there, as we did when we were in Brazil. So I'm very much looking forward to that. I think, Black Alliance for Peace, which is co-leading the Afro-descendant delegation with our friends from the Chisholm Legacy Project. Big shout out to Jackie Patterson and her amazing brilliance. Um, you know, Aaron and everyone, it's kind of come to our attention that sometimes the questions with the easiest answers are the hardest ones to ask. But they have to be asked, nonetheless. Everything that you've heard Isabella and Rachel bring up are going to force us to ask questions about the legitimacy of sort a lot of the international governing bodies that we're supposedly leaning on. Rachel was absolutely right. I mean, you heard James Hansen, even back when the Paris Climate Agreement came out, he, was skeptical, and today he's calling it bullshit. I mean, just straight up, he's saying that this is a bullshit thing. But we have to ask ourselves about the institutions that came up with them in the first place, the same institutions that can't stop a genocide that's being live streamed, the same institutions that cannot stop a nation from illegally kidnapping and incarcerating a sitting president in Venezuela. And then, of course, we've heard it all. So first and foremost, to ask those really, really important questions, because it was clear after COP30 that no, maybe the UN is not, does not have the fitness to really prevent this planet from accelerating so much in global warming. And then, of course, we are going with an unapologetic Afro-descendant lens as it pertains to, just transition. We are excited to be hosted by Colombia. They have a landmark law called Colombia Law 70, which has repatriated lands to African descendants, African people who tend to live mostly on the Pacific coast. And we believe this can be a blueprint. You've got to have that sovereignty, and it's parallel to free, prior, and informed consent, which is language that we commonly use as it pertains to our indigenous comrades. But yeah, if you don't have sovereignty, that first and foremost, you can't make decisions about what's best and what's not best for your people. And then what I would also say is that two more things that I think we're going to really be bringing as Afro descendants is that, pan-Europeanism is going to have to die if regenerative economies, where fossil fuels are obsolete, have any chance of living, right? We cannot approach this climate crisis from an Anglo-centric lens because that prevents us from then understanding the climate crisis as a crisis of people-centered human rights rather than a sort of Western Europeanism liberal understanding of human rights, right? Liberalism hasn't been able to achieve a real human rights because at the heart of a liberal project are exclusionary criteria for those who deserve to have rights and those who don't. And that's tragically, as Isabella said, of the people who have been most oppressed for the last 500 years. So I guess we're going down there with a lot of interventions. We're kind of getting our Biggie Smalls on and going down there to do a lot of battle rapping, I guess with our comrades. But it's we're going to have to get a little confrontational because I don't want to come back as disappointed as Rachel as I did, like from Brazil, but also not expecting, that we're going to come back with this grand plan and we're going to be off of fossil fuels. We are going to Nuestra America, also the zone of peace, and I think that we will all have a collective message that any zone of peace is going to have to be fossil fuel free as well.
Yeah. So maybe just to add a bit more context to what the Santa Marta Conference is. So, okay, so in the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign, we now have 18 nations that have formally engaged with the Fossil Fuel Treaty process and are meeting regularly to discuss like how we could get towards a negotiation mandate for a fossil fuel treaty. And in conversations around that, there's sort of a discussion of the need for a series of standalone diplomatic conferences that specifically address fossil fuels, which create enough space to talk about economic dependence, militarism, mechanisms that are necessary, debt, etc. In a way that there might not be enough space for all of those conversations if it's trying to be like squeezed into the UNFCCC process. And an outside of the UN standalone diplomatic series of conferences would also create space to have this sort of like coalition of doers approach, the countries that are ready to get started on talking about fossil fuel phase out without the role of blockers in the room. And so so there's 18 countries that have formally endorsed the concept of a fossil fuel treaty, mostly Pacific Islands, which are so on the front lines of climate crisis, Caribbean islands, but also Colombia, Pakistan, and Timor-Leste as the fossil fuel exporters in the bloc of nations. And Colombia, out of those conversations, decided to host a diplomatic conference on the transition away from fossil fuels, which is taking place in Santa Marta in April. And now we'll have 45 countries so far that have agreed to come talk about fossil fuel phase out and sort of what is actually necessary to make that happen. And this will be the first in a series of diplomatic conferences. So already Tuvalu has announced that they will be hosting a second conference. And we'll have more details on that shared in Santa Marta. And so this is a space to really move beyond. I think we're all very good at saying we need to phase out fossil fuels. We're all really good at saying someone should do something about this. There's a connection between fossil fuels and all these other issues. But if we're being serious that there's a connection between fossil fuels and all these other issues, that's a really complicated international system to unwind. It's one where there's a lot of influence of the fossil fuel lobby, of petrostates, etc. And it is, as we've said, it's, an issue on many fronts. How do we deal with the links between fossil fuels and debt? How do we deal with the links between fossil fuels and militarism? How do we deal with some of the actual complicated processes of transitioning energy systems and economies away from fossil fuels? And how do we move on to renewables without repeating the same process over again with rare earth minerals and critical minerals, for instance? And so all of those things require space for dedicated conversation that really start to create the work plan for how we would actually pull off this type of transition. And so Santa Marta becomes the space to really try to kickstart those conversations and to try to do it in a way that engages more perspectives from the start, is Global South led, is a place where countries can sort of start to draw out the vision for a world beyond fossil fuels, and then we can collectively figure out how to fight for it. And so I think, yeah, it's going to be a place for a lot of really interesting conversations. And if you want to hear more about the conference itself and ways to plug in, the Fossil Fuel Treaty will be hosting a briefing in a couple of weeks. Can drop the link in the chat for that. And then I think personally, I lead our campaigning in North America. And so I think my role there is really to be talking to Anthony and others about what it looks like from within the heart of empire to be taking an anti-imperialist stance and really aligning our anti-war movements, our anti-fossil fuel movements, our climate movements, are sort of like all the different movements that Isabella named that need to be operating as a united front. How do we be moving with an internationalist approach in solidarity with this global South-led vision for a world beyond fossil fuels, rather than necessarily like fighting for a return to the US as a climate leader. And we just need to get a president that cares about climate change again, and then we'll fight for it in the UNFCCC, right? Like we need to be beyond approaches that have not worked in the last 30 years. We can't be fighting for a return to those approaches. We need to be really taking seriously the need to be aligning an anti-imperialist globalist movement in the US with the leadership that is coming out of communities on the front lines at home and globally, and really starting to think about how do we align our tactics and our strategies and our theory of change and our understanding of how power moves and how we have influence over that power from within the core of the empire, making sure that our movements are sort of aligned with those goals instead of a return to the system that wasn't working in the first place.
Amen. I think so we're approaching the hour. And if y'all don't mind sticking on, I want to give everyone sort of a moment to give some closing words. But for anyone who does need to head out, I just wanted to plug that everyone can learn what Code Pink is doing around Earth Month by going to codepink.org/Earth Month 2026 or Earth Day 2026. We're trying to expand screenings of the film Earth's Greatest Enemy around the country and really trying to see where we can bring these convenings locally to bring environmental groups in, bring labor groups in, bring folks who have connections to military families in and talk about conscientious objection, thinking about whatever struggle is happening locally is one that isn't just a climate struggle, isn't just an environmental struggle, isn't just an anti-war or anti-imperialist struggle. It is the struggle against the fossil fuel imperialist regime that we are taking on. It's the struggle for life in all of its forms. And so I really encourage folks to plug in there. We have a bunch of different ways to engage, flyers to go to Earth Day events. I'll support anyone in doing these screenings, bringing them to environmental organizations like the Sierra Club. So really encourage folks to plug in and also to sign that petition to the Environmental Defense Fund before we deliver it in New York next week. So I really appreciate everyone so much for being here. I think just I want to give everyone a few minutes to just say any closing words and thoughts, but I think to encapsulate a lot into sort of one sentence or question, um, there is so much happening right now. The US is escalating warfare in new ways every single day, which we're talking about the bombardment of Iran in coordination with Israel, the invasion of Venezuela, data centers, which are a new representation of a lot of this warfare and environmental destruction in everyone's backyards. And so I think there's inevitable ways that all of this is affecting the climate movement and affecting the movement that we're trying to build that doesn't have one singular definition or title. But I want to sort of just any closing thoughts on what this current moment is doing and demanding of us, which I know is a lot. But
Yeah, I mean, this is Octavia Butler. I mean, like it's this is what she told us, right? This is what Lenin and Marx told us as well. And it's the end of the beginning if we don't end it all together, right? And Rachel is absolutely right. No more, 20th century solutions for 21st century challenges. That's just not going to cut it. This is almost like a harbinger of like how much it can get worse still. And I think that it's okay to be scared, but scared into action and scared into imaginative action, right? Last thing I'll say is that Amitav Ghosh is right, to Rachel's points and to Isabella's points that the climate crisis is a crisis of imagination. And that's why we are going to need our largely funded organizations who are more funded than we are to either start getting an imaginative or just get the F out of our way. Like look at these two sisters. They're ready, like they are ready to take it on if you are not ready to be imaginative because I'm scared. I got a baby coming in 2 months and I'm like, what the hell did I do that for? So and I don't want to feel that way as a new father. But when you have comrades like Isabella and yourself, Aaron, and Comrade Medea and Comrade Grace and Comrade Rachel and so many more, I think we're getting to a point where we're not going to ask nicely anymore. Rachel's originally from the Midwest. I live in the Midwest now. And like, no more Midwest nights when we're fighting for our lives. And I'm looking forward to carrying that ethos with folks like you and all the amazing people who are on tonight.
Yeah, I'll just pop in and say, yeah, I'm also also based in the Midwest. So we've got a team of Midwesterners who are very angry, which which is not very common to see. So yeah, it was an honor to be on this panel with you all. I think I want to end off by saying or just sharing why CFA often kind of quotes Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, where he says each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. And we believe that the time for our generation to discover its mission and to fulfill it is now. And we are really, really excited to be igniting frontline fights across the so-called US, recognizing that you don't have to live next to oil and gas build-out, because the financiers and the insurers of these awful oil and gas corporations are in everyone's backyard. And so, yeah, I'll invite any young people on this call to join us, join Ignition Front, and be a part of our movement to stop US-led fossil-fueled capitalist imperialism.
Yeah, I guess my final thoughts would maybe be that, I think for a long time, there's been sort of an assumption that in order to build bigger movements, we need to tone down our message or meet people where they are by only using language that is comfortable to them. But like what is coming is not going to be comfortable to them. What is coming has already been incredibly violent and dangerous for a lot of communities. And now is not the time to be shying away from like really naming the systems that we are up against. The fact that we are being out organized by many groups who have a stake in death when we are fighting for our lives. And to really be building the relationships and the capacity to engage in like interpersonal conflict that is necessary to help people get through mental barriers around, like fear is a really effective organizing tool and they have used it really well against us. And everything that we are facing is going to keep provoking fear. And so it's on us as those who are organizing around these issues and fighting for peace and fighting for an end to systems of imperialism and domination and violence to be capable of helping people work through those emotions and really start to understand the roots of these issues in order to understand exactly what Isabella was saying earlier, which is that all of our fights are linked, all of our safety is intertwined. We are all the many faces of a shared fight, and that means building our capacity to really name things clearly and help people see it rather than shying away from using language that we fear might turn people off in this kind of moment. And so, yeah, I guess maybe just yeah, being a truth teller in this kind of era can be quite difficult, but like it's our job to build our capacity to tell that truth rather than toning it down in these moments.
Absolutely. I think you've all given us the task that we need of building this renewed clarity so that we can really build the movement that we need for our survival. We really have no choice but to take all of this on, and understand, be as clear-eyed as possible so that we can build an unstoppable movement for the people and the planet. And so thank you all for giving the insights and the direction and the places where we can convene the nodes where we're able to break down the silos of our so-called separate movements, and join together. So thank you all so much. Thank you everyone so much for joining this webinar and kicking off Earth Month with us. Hope everyone brings some of these lessons throughout the month whenever these conversations come up. Hope that everyone plugs in. And I hope everyone tonight does something to rejuvenate you so that you can keep going and organizing and fighting tomorrow. So thank you all, and I hope you all have a great night.